relationships are tough. Having a family is tough. It's just a part of life, right? So you have to have that, what I would call that essential focus, to not take your eye off the prize. And that prize to me is being able to raise two healthy kids that will go on to be upstanding citizens in the grand scheme of things, and being able to enjoy the rest of my life with my wife once they have moved on and are starting their own family.
This is Dadography, a podcast with stories and insights on fatherhood from dads around the globe, dedicated to providing you with the tools and tips to become a better dad. Welcome, everyone, to Season 3 of the Dadography podcast. I'm your host, Corey Ward. Normally, we take a break between seasons, but we've been getting such positive feedback from you guys, we've decided to continue the conversations and continue getting those insights that will ultimately help us become better dads. We appreciate your feedback, and we thank you for your support. Today, we have a guest, Mr. Carlton Langley, that's going to be sharing with us about his fatherhood experience. Carlton, welcome to the show, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well, Corey. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate you having me on today.
Well, I'll tell you what, the pleasure is all mine. Of course, we have a mutual friend, and he has spoken highly of you, and I look forward to getting to know you a little bit more here on the podcast. You will note that in our pre-conversation communication that I did not send you a bio, and that was intentional. It's because I prefer that the father usually have an opportunity to introduce himself to our audience as well as to me. So if you would, Carlton, give me a little bit about yourself, man.
So my name's Carlton Langley. I'm a married father of two kids, a 17-year-old boy named Trey, and a 15-year-old daughter named Aiden. I was born in Jamaica. Was in Jamaica until I was about 8 years old, and then my family moved to the New York City area. Grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, where I spent most of my early teenage years, and then I went to Penn State University. Ended up meeting my future wife there. I'm an IT consultant with a background in a software package called SAP, and have been doing that for the last 20 years or so. Definitely a challenging job that I like, but it's not my number one job though. My number one job is, I believe, being a father, and that's why I'm so excited to actually talk to you today. So thanks for having me.
I hear you, man. You know, Carlton, I have a good friend of mine that says, and he wasn't speaking directly to being a father, but he said a man's work is never done.
Ever.
So
Never.
when I hear the demanding nature of the IT consulting profession, and then automatically knowing the demands of fatherhood, I'm thinking, my friend was right again.
Never done, ever done. Yeah, it's just
Yeah.
it's fun though. It keeps you on your toes for sure. Same thing as you're saying about fatherhood, right? You think you might know, or you might get tips and tricks from your dad or friends and so on, but no two stories are the same, right? So you just gotta be prepared to work, and that's
Yeah,
what it's about.
I agree with you 100%. One of the things that we've seen over the span of the show is what you said, just how different fatherhood can be depending on the setting, depending on the country, depending on the spouse situation or the lack thereof, and the upbringing, and so many variables in that
Absolutely.
equation,
Yeah,
so
for
many
sure.
variables.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of variables, Carlton, give me a story from your childhood that would convey to me your father's personality and fatherhood style.
Oh man, it's a good question. My dad passed away a couple years ago, but he was a great man. His parenting style was one that was just very laid back, super laid back, but super demanding at the same time. I don't know if some people don't believe those two things really go together, right? Just wasn't I would say the super disciplinarian. That was more my mom more than anything else. My
Okay.
dad was just one that wanted us to just strive to do and be whatever we wanted to be in many respects, right? So I talk about my dad when it comes to education. That's like the big thing that I think he instilled in us. And my mother did it as well. It's actually pretty interesting that my dad didn't get past sixth grade, but there's so many people that we've met over the years that when they speak to him, they think he was a guy that graduated college and did all this stuff, because he was just like an avid reader. He read everything. It didn't matter whether it was the Bible or other history books or science fiction. He just read like crazy. So he was just very like cultured. Just for a person who didn't have any sort of formal education, it was crazy how he viewed the world and how much knowledge he had, right? And that was one thing that he really pushed on us. Like, if there was one thing that he did not like mince words with, or that laid back nature I was mentioning to you, when it came to education, he didn't play with that, because he always felt as though that was the one thing that would give us a chance to live a much better life, because we grew up pretty poor. And them coming to the US and feeling as though there was an education system that had more opportunities. Not that Jamaica is a great educational system, but the amount of opportunities you have as you go further were not as much, right? He didn't push any particular narrative when it came to you should be this or you should be that. Just go to school, keep going, keep going. I would say definitely one of my role models.
Yeah, yeah, that's fantastic. As you mentioned, how he was essentially a lifelong learner. I like him already because that's very akin to my personality. I read a book. My kids go, "Why are you reading that?" It's called A Brief History of Mathematics.
Hmm.
And my kids are like, "Who reads a book on math?" I was like, "It's like, well, you got to stay in the know, man. You got to understand these things." So
Someone who
hopefully
always
they'll
wants to learn, right?
right. So hopefully they'll pick that up for me. Did you ever make any decisions when you were a child about the type of father you would be based on the type of father that your dad was?
Yeah. So my dad was an interesting guy. So as I said, very laid back, very focused on education, but like all of us, right, we're all pretty flawed in other ways, right? His devotion to his family was one thing that I definitely felt like, as I got older and started to learn more about myself and so on, was something that I felt like I had to make sure was a part of my parental experience, right? Like, he was a guy that made a lot of mistakes. He had some situations that happened outside of the family where I end up having other siblings that some people would look down upon, and it was an experience for him that, even though it wasn't the greatest for his, I guess what you would call his immediate family, for him, it was still a responsibility that he felt that he had to be committed to. So I have brothers and sisters that he continually took ownership of his mistake. I hate calling it mistakes, but you get what I'm saying. That he took responsibility for some of those
Decisions that he made. I
decisions that he
mean,
made. Right,
yeah,
exactly. He took responsibility for them, and I grew up with brothers and sisters who, we had good relationships, and it's a testament to the strength of my mother, to be honest with you, in some ways.
of
But
course.
um, that devotion to his kids was something that I don't think I'll ever see as a bad thing, because it's never the kid's fault. A child doesn't come into this world without two consenting adults, in most cases. So that was something that I always said, I don't want to make the same mistakes per se, but I want to have that same devotion to my family and my kids, and make sure that they have the best of whatever situation it is, rich, poor, or otherwise. And that was something that that I think I really admired about him, even though it was a tough circumstance for our family. I was a little kid at the time because I'm one of the youngest in my family, so I didn't really know any better. I just, oh, okay. But as you get older and
Right.
you start thinking about it, you're like, oh man, that wasn't the greatest, but look at how it turned out, right? So
Right.
it's just one of those things that I took what would be looked at as a negative, and thought that was something that was pretty admirable, because a lot of times when you make those decisions and things like that happen, you end up turning your back on those situations, and that's not what he did.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that one of the things you gleaned from him and hoped to implement when you became an adult was to have the same level of commitment to family. What about a self-assessment, Carlton? How you doing on that commitment, brother?
Yeah, I mean, I'm perfect now. Let me stop. No, no, I think I'm doing pretty good. I think you would have to ask everybody else because for me, I know what I'm focused on. I would hope that most people that are looking at it from the outside see that devotion to family and kids because like everybody else, right? Relationships are tough. Having a family is tough. It's just a part of life, right? So you have to have that what I would call that essential focus to not take your eye off the prize. And that prize to me is being able to raise two healthy kids that will go on to be upstanding citizens in the grand scheme of things, and being able to enjoy the rest of my life with my wife once they have moved on and are starting their own family. So I think I'm doing okay. I'm definitely not perfect. I have my flaws, but for me, it's really just keeping that focus and making sure that they have all the things that I didn't have. Because I say this as a joke, but I spoil my kids. I have high expectations of them, but I spoil them because they are living in a much different situation than we were. We grew up like super poor. There was a lot of
Okay.
love at home. I don't want to discount that. There was a ton of love at home, and until I got older, I didn't really know we were poor because I don't think most kids know what poor means. But they are in a much different situation than my wife and I grew up in, and even worse, my parents, they were even poorer. You know what I mean? So it was just like every generation you hope it gets better, and I think
Right.
I'm trying. I'm doing my best to play my part in making sure that they are in a much better situation than I was in.
For what it's worth, Carlton, I applaud you for being conscious of the fact that you want to be the best dad, husband you can be. Because what happens, I think, in many cases, is that men find themselves on autopilot. So, as opposed to it ever being any thought about whether or not I'm a good husband or a good dad, they just, they do what they do, and everybody else just follow along. So, I definitely think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I won't lie and say there aren't periods where that happens because there are times we get tired. We get tired too, right? The work, like you said, the work is never done, but there are times we get tired, and there are times you have that "woe is me" type of feeling, but you have to just get over that and move on because nobody's gonna do the work for you. It's always coming.
Well, one of the things you said earlier is that you're not perfect. And I think the very first episode we had was entitled Progress Over Perfection. So I think if a person can commit themselves to just forward motion, as you mentioned, we all recognize we're not perfect. So we don't have to try to plant our flag on that hill.
Right?
But we should definitely be looking for progress. And progress is, we'll take it.
Yeah,
We'll
for
take it.
sure, for
Definitely.
sure.
So, what was the transition like, though, man? And I know you were young. You mentioned you were like what, 7, 8. So, but coming from Jamaica to the States, what what was that transition like?
It was super exciting. I remember as a little kid going back and forth from where we lived in the country to Kingston to go to the embassy, and it was back and forth, back and forth. I even remember a time where I thought that we were going to the U.S. like that week or something like that. I don't know exactly why I thought that, but I thought we were going to, and I was saying that to all my little friends in school. And then I went back to school and I was so embarrassed.
That's hilarious.
I'm telling I'm serious because they were making fun of me. Like I still remember that. It's funny how you hold on to some of those little things from when you were a kid. And I can still picture myself in grade school with that experience. But when we finally did go to the U.S., I still remember. Flying into New York City and seeing the lights and all that type of stuff. It was crazy. It was just one of those things where it was just like, wow. But once I got to the U.S., it was actually kind of interesting because in Jamaica, even though we were poor, we still lived in a house. There were trees and a yard, and we come to New York City, and we're living in a one bedroom apartment, nine of us in a one bedroom apartment, there's like rats and roaches and all types of crazy stuff. At the time as a kid, you're not really thinking about that, but when you think back on it, that's very different, right? Coming from a place where you could grow your own food, you never really thought you would ever go hungry or anything like that. But when you come into like the concrete jungle of New York City, it's like a whole different experience. But one of the things that I remember the most was when I started school was that um, having an accent. They used to pick on me a lot. Like they used to call me Jamaican booty scratcher and all types of stupid stuff. And that made the transition a little interesting,
To
or I
say the
guess a little
least,
rough.
right?
In, yeah, in the beginning, but then you start getting your core group of friends, and then I was always one of the I guess I don't want to call it smarter, but I did my work. So it was just funny that with that I ended up getting a lot of friends because they'd want me to help them with stuff. So it was definitely an interesting time, especially for a little kid. But that went away within a couple months because after a while they realize you're just like the rest of them.
Let me ask you this, and before we move forward here, I got to see if I can get a good understanding of one more thing as it relates to your dad. So, you just mentioned how when you got to the U.S., you were in school, and you got your work done. You don't want to toot your own horn and say that you're smart, right? But you're probably smart, brother. But anyway, but that being said, do you think that your father effectively gave you a love for learning, or was it more of just a taskmaster for learning, and so you developed the discipline to just do it? So I'm curious about that.
That's a great question because I don't think he was a taskmaster for learning. I think he just had me around him so much. It made me
Mm,
sort of emulate him,
right.
right?
Okay.
Because so I have an older
Mm-hmm.
brother, and people always make fun, or some of my brothers and sisters make fun and say, "Why are you junior?" Because my dad is name is Carlton as well. So why they didn't name my older brother Carlton is a a topic for discussion at times. But I'm the junior, so he used to always have me everywhere. Anywhere he went, anywhere he was at, I was around, and he sort of like showed me off, and I think just by watching him, I think that's where that thirst for learning and it just quite frankly it just kind of came easy
Mm-hmm.
for me. So I just happened to be one of those ones that school seemed to come easy
Mm-hmm.
for, and but I think a lot of that was probably just by watching him because he wasn't in school, but he read a lot, and I think I that's where I probably picked it up from because he wasn't a taskmaster. He preached it, but he wasn't like sit down, you have to do your work from 3 to 5 every day, and those types of
Right.
things. That wasn't really him because, as I said, he was pretty laid
Okay.
back. He wanted you to be all you can be in whatever you wanted to do. So I think I just picked it up by seeing what he did,
Would
I
you
guess.
say, of course, Jamaica and then New York? Did you have a happy childhood as it relates to your father?
Absolutely, without a doubt,
That's fantastic.
without a doubt
That's
in my mind.
fantastic.
There's no question about that because I think he they tell a story. My mom and my mom tells a story all the time to this day to people. She said that, and I heard them say this together. They said when I was born, I had one hair in my head, and it was golden. That's the story. I swear to you, that's the story they tell all the time to people that I had one hair on my head and it was a gold hair, and supposedly they knew that I was going to be special. I find that kind of comical,
Right.
um, but truthfully, I think after that, like they saw that I had a aptitude for learning, and I picked up on things quickly. So the rest of my brothers and sisters think I was spoiled. Even though we were poor and didn't have a lot, they always seemed to go out of their way to get things for me. Like a story I tell is I remember remember we were like super poor, living in a 1 bedroom apartment, 9 of us, and they went out and got me a $2,000 Tandy computer so that I can do programming and whatever the heck I wanted to do on a computer. And they didn't really have it like that. Truth be told, they shouldn't have done that, right? But they did because they saw something. they saw something in me that they believed in, and wanted to, you know, keep pushing that forward. So, in terms of my childhood, I mean, my parents and my dad, they provided a lot when they didn't have a lot. You know what I mean? So it was definitely a loving family and childhood that I don't regret
Well,
anything
Carlton,
about.
I don't know. Now you say they shouldn't have done that, but I gotta say, my man, you are this day an IT consultant with $2,000 computer. You know what I mean? I don't know. They might have somebody might have hit the nail on the head. May not.
Yeah, yeah, they saw something for sure. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
seriously. Yeah,
man.
yeah, yeah. You're right. Parents, like to try to recognize things in their kids that others don't see, and I guess they saw something while they were pushing and providing some of those things that I guess a lot of other kids weren't.
With
You know.
all of your experience from moving from one culture to another, you mentioned some of the family challenges that you didn't face, but your mom and dad certainly did with some siblings outside of the marriage, and taking all of that into consideration, and now here you are, you've got a 15-year-old, you've got a 17-year-old, and you're a dad. What's your approach to fatherhood, man?
Ah, truthfully, I don't know if I have an approach. My kids will tell you that I'm pretty demanding. I spoil the hell out of them. But I get them just about anything they want, within reason. But they know that comes at a cost, right? And what's that cost? That cost is your grades, right? Your grades start to slip. I will take things away. I will shut off your internet. I will do whatever I need to do because your job is school, right? So, you want to play sports, you want to do all those things, great. I'm going to support you. It's going to cost me a lot of time, money, effort, whatever it is, but I'm going to support you because I want you to do things that you love to do. But the one thing I will not waver on is your commitment to education because, even though you're in a better situation than me, I've seen a lot of people in good situations fall by the wayside because they just don't have that focus. So I wouldn't say I necessarily have an approach, Corey. I take it day by day. I try not to be too overbearing, especially now as they're becoming like young adults. When they were little kids, you're super overprotective because you think that everybody's out to get them or something bad is going to happen. And as they get a little older, you have to allow them to explore and become young adults and make mistakes, right? But at the same time, you still need to be protective because they don't know what they don't know, right? So for me, it's more just trying to let them explore and learn and grow, make some mistakes, but still know that I'm there behind them when they need me. But if they ain't doing their work, if that work ain't being done, we have a problem. So a lot of it is, I believe, is more in education. I saw what it's done for me, and I believe in it. I always feel like having that education as your backdrop. If some of those other things that you want to do, if they don't if they don't succeed, you have that education behind you that will help.
Yeah,
So that's why I push that so
I
much.
think it's excellent. One of the things that I count to be my responsibility as a father, and this you'll probably catch a glimpse of why I asked you this earlier, is that I consider it to be my responsibility to help my kids fall in love with learning. I'm really pro education, and maybe not so much educational system, and I know that's a huge topic of debate, and people can go back and forth, but I think if a parent can teach their child or children to love to learn, then they'll always push forward. Of course, I'm not in the
Right.
situation where I have to encourage my kids to avoid educational system. I'm not pro, but I think the underlying idea is to get them to love education, which is why I asked, how did your dad do that? That's something
Yeah.
special. It really is, because no matter what, whether it's a brief history of mathematics or IT consulting, if they're interested in it, if they love to learn, then they'll pick up a book and get it on their own, which would be a great supplement to whatever they're learning in school. So
Yeah. And that's what I think I struggle with. So, we talk about all the things that we do as parents or as dads and so on to try to get your kids to, learn and do things. I struggle with that. I think, am I pushing too hard when it comes to that, right? Because I don't want them to hate learning because dad pushed so hard when it comes to the education
Mm.
side of the house.
Corey here, wanting to give you a personal invitation to follow us on Instagram. You can find us at Dadography Podcast. It's really good because you get an opportunity to put a face with the voice that gave you some insight or some encouragement on your journey in fatherhood. We look forward to having you follow us on Instagram at Dadography Podcast. Yeah, one of the things that I've said to my children before, I've said to them that everything you want is on the other side of effort. So if you put in the
Yeah,
effort, if you want to be on your device, play this video game, if you want to spend this time doing this, uh, you can have it. It's just on the
yeah,
other side of effort. Like you can't just
I
wake
like
up
that.
and just be so privileged that, oh, guess what? I play video games all day. And
Right.
and I order food online. And I kick my feet up. And I don't clean my room. And I don't even have to wash the dishes. So it's kind of like,
Right.
listen, bro, everything you want, and it's okay to want stuff, but I need you to understand it's on the other side of effort, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. I don't say it in those exact words, but I tell them that it's all in the work you put in, right? Because, so they both play sports and they want to be good and they want to go on to play college sports and all this type of stuff. They're a little bit bigger than some of the other kids. And they work to get to be good, but they could be so much better if they spent another hour every day or every other day, perfecting their craft. But they don't. They'd rather be playing the video games and all those types of things. So I tell them, look, you want to be this exceptional player, you got to put exceptional time in, and that's that effort that you're talking
Yeah,
about. So
indeed. Well, now when I
yeah,
think of New York, you mentioned Mount Vernon, just bordering with the Bronx. I think of urban environment. I think of a lot of opportunities to go astray. Your dad played a role in leading you away from that. So you had an opportunity to go to Penn State and finish school and then get into a particular industry. How different is growing up in or well, actually, you're not in New York now, are you?
no, I live outside of Philadelphia now. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a huge difference in terms of what you experience and then what your kids are experiencing. Am I correct in assuming that?
Oh yeah, for sure. Living in New York City was pretty much, concrete jungle. Living in an apartment building, where I am live right now, I live in an area that's considered Amish country. So my kids, if you sit out on my back porch every day, you will see Amish people riding by in a horse and buggy, right? You'll look across the street at the Amish farm and see horses out there and cows and all that type of stuff. So it's a totally, when I say totally different environment than I grew up in, but that's pretty much all they know. Now, we make sure, because my wife and I are both, my wife is from Brooklyn, and very similar environment to how I grew up. We make sure that we take them back home, right? And we go back to those environments that we grew up in, so that they may not know it per se, but they're getting a little taste of it, right? They're going in and having to stay with our family members who haven't necessarily gotten out of that environment, right? Because we want them to see the good and the bad, and that life isn't just about this cushy environment that you're living in, right? There are people that are still struggling, and part of that is to show them that things can be good and things can be bad, but if you have that proper perspective, you can continue to live a good life. But part of it too is just to make sure that they understand that there are people out there that, even though they may be living in this different environment, or what people may consider a worse environment, they're still good people. And that's the important lesson that we try to teach them, right? Doesn't matter how how a person is living. you treat them with the same respect that you're going to treat somebody who you think is well off, right? So we make sure we bring them back to those environments. We go and visit our families. We have our families come here, and they know where we came from. We are not ashamed that we grew up poor. It's a part of what made us, right? So, you know.
That's one of the things where I think my wife and I, we've. I don't. I'm not sure we're doing as good as we could do. My wife is from Guyana originally, and I'm originally from Florida, Jacksonville, Florida. So I grew up in a typical, I like to say, typical African American urban environment, right? So the hood, right? And my wife, of course, being from Guyana, but her family, they were not poor. Um, Nonetheless, very different from the U.S. So our upbringing was very different from our children. And like you mentioned earlier, we try to do as much as we can for our kids that have the good fortune to be able to travel and experience different countries
Right.
and things like that. One of the things that I struggled with is trying to help them not develop a mentality of privilege and it's supposed to be this way.
Yeah,
And because I think that works counterproductive to just gratitude. And I tell you what, Carlton,
absolutely.
that's an uphill battle, brother. I mean, it's.
Yeah,
But I like the fact that you give them opportunities to see hands on, with different family members and taking them to where you guys came from and have experience. And here's hoping that it works. What it is that you're trying to do with them and just their mindset as a whole, for sure. Now you mentioned that you born in Jamaica, raised up until 8 years old, still a lot of strong Jamaican heritage. Is your wife of Jamaican descent as well?
no, she's actually Dominican. Yeah,
Okay.
she was born in Dominican Republic and came to the U.S. when she was 8. So we came to the U.S. Right around the same time in the mid '80s.
Hmm.
Her family went to Brooklyn and ours went to the Bronx area, and we ended up meeting in college, and the rest is,
Nice.
I guess you would say, history, right?
So, with both of you having backgrounds outside of the U.S., what significance has the cultural diversity play in the raising of the kids?
We make sure that they know those two cultures, right? We take them back to Jamaica, we take them back to Dominican Republic, we take them
Yeah.
to New York, and to see all those types of things, right? So I think our culture is important to us, and we may have come here as young kids, and most people that talk to us don't because we don't really have an accent. We didn't come here as teenagers. Most people that come as teenagers, it's hard for them to lose their accents, but we came here as little kids. So most people can't tell that we're from our countries, but at the same time, that's a strong part of our heritage, and we want our kids to know that as well. And I believe some of those lessons that we learned from our own parents and how they were raised is what we're passing on to our kids, and hopefully when they have kids and so on, they'll do some of the same things. But culturally, I think it's a beautiful mix, But I think much of the Caribbean had the culture and the food might be a little bit different, but in terms of how we think about the family structure and even some of the bad parts of it as well, in terms of like infidelity and machoism and that type of stuff,
Right.
is very similar across those and that happens in American culture too. So I'm not trying to say Caribbean culture is a whole bunch of machismo, but I think a lot of the Caribbean male dominated societies, it's very similar.
You went to Penn State. Were you involved in? You mentioned your kids are athletic. So did you play sports at Penn State?
Yeah, I did. So when I went to Penn State, I tried out for the team and made it.
Which team?
The basketball team. The
Okay.
basketball team. So I went to a high school that's like a basketball powerhouse in New York State.
Okay.
And so almost everybody on the team played college basketball. I went away to Penn State on an academic scholarship, and I wasn't even intending to play basketball when I got there. but just during open gym and playing with the team a couple times, they invited me to come out and try out and end up making the team. So that was a pretty interesting experience to say the least.
I hear you, man. Well, what about your kids now? What sports do they play?
So my son plays football, basketball, and they're doing some track right now because the conversation we were having a little bit earlier about them sitting around and being on devices and so on. So
Hmm.
basketball season just ended. So they play AAU basketball, which is like travel basketball, but that's only like two days a week, as opposed to when they're in season in their schools. That's like 6 days a week, 5 or 6 days a week. So I don't want them just sitting on their butts on these devices. So they're doing track right now. So my son is basketball, football, and track, and my daughter is basketball and track.
Now, I think I just got myself a tip right there. So it sounds like you it sounds like you found activities for them to engage in outside of their device.
Yes, that's part of the strategy. That's absolutely a part of my strategy. I mean, I guess I'm a technologist, but I see some of the pitfalls of technology and how they can, essentially control you and take all your information and just influence you in ways that aren't always the greatest. So for me, any way that I can try to get them to get away from that, even if it's for an hour, right? An hour or two a day.
Right.
That's an hour or two less that they're absorbing that influence that isn't necessarily the best. So I try to use sports as one of the ways that I try to do that. Or there are times we'll go outside and like, yo, let's go shoot some hoops, go do something. It may not necessarily be an organized activity, but there's some things. Sometimes I'll just force them out of the house. Put your phone down. We're going for a walk. just little things.
Do they
Yeah.
like the sports, or is it all force fed?
This is the first season they're doing track. I don't think they love track right now,
Okay.
but I'm not. I wouldn't say I don't care, but I don't think they
Executive
love
decision.
executive decision. Absolutely, an executive decision when it comes to that one. My son loves football and basketball. My daughter loves basketball. That's like her thing. She did competitive cheerleading for a long time,
Okay.
and then had this growth spurt and wanted to play basketball. So she ended up self-selecting into basketball after she had played a little when she was really young, but then didn't play for a good 5 or 6 years, and is just been playing for a little bit less than 2 years again, and is actually doing really well. I noticed that as you were talking about these strategies, one of the things I thought about as you were saying that was I do most of the driving to these activities. My son is driving now, so now he's driving a lot more. But for a lot of years, it was me doing most of the driving, if there weren't split activities, because I love going and seeing them, you know, uh, participate in sports, and I think it is one of the ways that I get to connect with them because when I'm in the house, a lot of times there's so much to do at home. Something always needs to be done at home, right? And I'm always running, or I would say I work a lot. To those same points you made a little bit earlier of you needing to carve out time. I always found it hard to carve those times out to really connect with them. And I always found that when I was driving them to these activities, those would be some of the best conversations I have with them because I'd be able to just talk nonsense to them at times, but sometimes just ask them things that I wouldn't find myself asking them in the house, right? A lot of it would rotate around their sports and how they're feeling about it and stuff like that, but it would inevitably veer into other types of topics that you get to see their mindset and see what motivates them. For me, those drives with my kids were a time for me to connect with them, right? So I guess that was another strategy, maybe not intentionally done, but something that I realized I got a lot of value out of.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this, Carlton, before we come to a close. And obviously, I know you can't speak on all fronts, but as it relates to sports, if you were to encourage fathers listening to this show about the benefits of team sports, obviously, your son plays football, Your daughter plays basketball. They're both running track. Your son also plays basketball. From your observation, your experience, what are some of the benefits? Obviously, away from the device, right? Like I'm going to count that as a benefit. That's I'm sure
That's
that's
absolutely a benefit.
yeah, but I know there are people out there. It's debatable, right? But okay,
Yeah,
for the sake of our conversation, it's unanimous decision, right? That it's
that's
a
right.
that it's the
It's a
benefit.
benefit.
But
Done.
um, but that being said, what are some of the other benefits of you've seen your kids playing team sports?
I actually think team sports teaches a lot about life, right? How many things are you going to do in your life that you will do totally on your own? Totally on your own without somebody assisting you or you assisting someone else?
Very
Very
few.
little.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So team sports teaches you a lot about life. It teaches you how to play a role. There are times that you're going to be the star or the team lead, right? There are going to be other times that you just have to be a role player and do your little part, but it's a part of that engine that makes that team go, right? Or that car go, right?
Right.
So to me, just team sports is a microcosm of life in general and what you're going to have to deal with, right? It's no different than you being a part of your family and y'all have these different roles. Today you have to do the dishes, you have to do laundry, you have to go cut the grass. It's all a part of, as I would say, an engine that needs to go, and you have to play your part. So I would encourage anyone, if they have the opportunity, to have their kids play team sports. I'm not saying that individual sports are a bad thing, but at the end of the day, I think team sports are more in line with what the life that they're going to experience is all about, as opposed to that individual where you need intense focus to be able to be successful at an individual sport. But I think they may have a tougher time potentially assimilating into a normal work environment if they don't become, let's say, a Tiger Woods or a Serena Williams who's just used to being the center of attention and can do
Right.
things on their own. So I wholeheartedly believe that team sports in any capacity is going to start teaching kids about life as a whole and how to become more confident in whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I hear you, man. Of course, jiu-jitsu is not a team sport, but one of the things that I really enjoy about my son being in jiu-jitsu is that he gets an opportunity to see consequences for errors immediately. Whereas a lot of times theoretically, we say, okay, well, son, if you do this, this is going to happen. And then, of course, that's going to happen probably in about 10 years from now, right?
Right.
But, okay, so if you don't block that, you're going to find yourself getting your arm almost broken. And it's immediate. And the other thing that I like about it is that he's growing accustomed to being under a tremendous amount of pressure and maintaining calm. And I think I told him recently, I was like, you've never solved any problem and you never will in your life through panic. I was like, you will calm down and come up with a solution.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. I actually think individual sports are those people that focus that you have to have to be successful at any sort of individual activity in sports. It's like it's tremendous, right? So it's one of those things that a lot of people can't really do, right? I've never I've never really played an individual sport, right? But when I think about, like I said, I always bring up Tiger Woods or Serena Williams or folks like that are just super successful at it. It's just like to have that focus and that mentality, and I guess maybe that instant feedback that you talk about is really what gets them to focus more, because they know exactly what, or if they're paying attention, they know exactly what went wrong, and they can fix that right away. I just wonder how, once they get out of that, how that plays well in the environment of, like, let's say, work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if
Mm-hmm.
you're so used to working on your own, you might not be able to play as well with people who are used to having to play, a little role. You know what I mean? So
Right.
it's just a question I have. But yeah,
Ultimately, I think being a team player is a life skill, and it will,
yeah,
as you mentioned earlier, it will serve a person on so many fronts because there are very few things that you do by yourself. And if you're honest, even if you do a substantial amount by yourself, you're still able to acknowledge there are other role players. I have a person that I really admire. It's a marathon runner named Elihu Kipchoge, and last year he did something that scientists said was humanly impossible, and he ran a marathon in less than 2 hours. And if you've ever run any kind of track, ever went jogging, when you hear 2 hours, you go, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute.
yeah,
How is that even possible? Right?
right.
So, but he was quoted after doing a 1 hour and 59 minute, 40 some odd second marathon. He was quoted as saying, 100% of me is not even 1% of the team. And he was acknowledging his nutritionist, his massage
Absolutely.
therapist, the guys that ran alongside him and just talked to him and keep his mind off the mile after mile that he was doing. All of these individuals played a role, and I think
Yeah,
if we're really honest, even if we're in an arena by ourselves, there's always someone
very
um,
true.
that we must give up gratitude to and express our thanks to.
That's a
Um,
great point. Yeah, that is a great point. So maybe I shouldn't think of team sports, I mean individual sports so much as, I guess the focus is always on that one person, but yeah,
right.
to your point, you have a whole slew of people that's contributing to that success. So maybe it's because you don't usually hear about any of those other folks. So you
Right.
don't really,
Exactly.
because even in a team sport, you have a whole slew of folks behind the scenes that's making that team, the trainers and everybody else.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right.
I
That
forget
is
what the
true.
percentage is, but there's like a huge percentage of people, like say military, right, that are in the military but never see battle in comparison to those that are in the military and see battle. But
Yeah.
the ones that never see the battle are so significant
Yep.
to the battle itself. So again,
Right.
the chef, right? Like you can't send a bunch of guys out there who haven't eaten for 2 months,
Right.
right? so,
Right.
so this
So
guy in the
so
kitchen does
everything's a
have some
team sport.
value.
Yeah, everything is a team sport at the end of the
Everything's a
day.
team sport, man.
Yeah, that's the lesson learned tonight.
Roger that. Well, listen, I do want to revisit the final thought on education. Your father played a significant role in encouraging you towards education, and from our conversation, I can only conclude that education is a big part of your children's upbringing. What encouragement would you give a dad that's listening who is wanting his children? And not, I'm not asking this question because I think you got it all figured out, but I see that you're headed in this direction. I see the progress over the perfection. What words of encouragement would you give to a dad who's really looking to try to encourage his children more towards education?
I'm not of the belief that any education is a bad education. I think back to the school system that I attended when I came to United States, so in Mount Vernon, New York, where
Okay.
we were considered a D-rated school system, right? So you tend to think people in D-rated schools aren't going to accomplish much or do necessarily well because they can't compete with the other top school systems,
Right.
right?
The A rated school.
Right, the A-rated schools, right? So, to me, the difference between an A and a D-rated schools is just basically the. I mean, there's a lot of factors, but a lot of it is dependent on the teachers that you get and grades and so on. But the reason I bring that up is because there's a lot of great teachers who are doing fantastic work in those D-rated schools, and they don't get enough credit for it, right? And kids are sponges. Kids are not just when they're 2 and 3, but throughout their teenage, they're sponges. I think as a parent, we just have to pay attention to them, right? And no matter what type of school they're in versus A versus D or whatever, you have to push your kids. In my opinion, you have to push them. You don't have to necessarily, just be on top of them nonstop and be like the stereotypical things that you see about Asian parents where they're just making their kids work all day at math and science and so on. I'm not saying like that. I'm saying just pay attention to your kids and see where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are. And it doesn't matter what type of school system you're in, just push them to do a bit more than they're being asked to do at school, because they can do it. And they all have that aptitude to learn. So for me, when it comes to education, it's really just exposing them to things that are gonna, what I believe will make them more successful in the future, right? So that means putting in front of them, like when my kids were little, putting computers in front of them, exposing them to different books, maybe kind of nudging them towards taking a language in school, right? Because some of these things are offered to kids in let's say middle and high school. But remember that we're kids, right? We're going to try to take the easiest route possible, right? So as a
Of
parent,
course.
that's for me to look and say, hey, like I was literally talking to my son. They were scheduling classes for next year, and they were asking about these different classes, and he's like, I want to take wood tech because I like tech. Okay, all right. I was like, so okay, take wood tech, but look, you also have another elective over here that they have a class on entrepreneurship. Don't you think that will be kind of cool? Right. So to me, it's just like paying attention and seeing what their needs are and give them a little nudge, because you have real world experience that you can provide to them and give them some direction. So for me, education is all about just opening their eyes to things that they may not see, and not pay attention to that narrative of good and bad school. If you have people that are willing to teach your kids, and you're paying attention to them, they can learn and be that sponge and absorb things that is going to make them better later on in life. So that's just my, I guess, my long-winded answer to a simple question.
It's well received, and I thank you for that. Carlton, I also want to thank you for being on the show. It's been a great conversation. I feel like I've gleaned a lot and a lot to think about and to put into effect as it relates to my fatherhood journey. So thank you so much for coming on to the Dadography podcast, and really appreciate it, man.
Thank you for having me, Corey. It's these are things that I think dads need to do a lot more of, right? Because as I'm talking to you, I'm learning as well, right? As we both said so far, there's no perfect dad, there's no perfect journey, and as long as we continue to be that lifelong learner, not just with books, but in how we are as parents, I think that's all we can do. So, I definitely thank you for having me on and getting to hear a part of your story as well. So, I think this is a fantastic platform that you're developing, and hopefully it just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Let's start with devotion, love, and loyalty. One of the core values Carlton learned from his imperfect father when it comes to his kids. We're all imperfect, so don't throw stones. Next is education. Yep, it comes in many forms. Formal education is what worked for him, so his strategy is that it could work for his kids. If it's nice, do it twice. While he can't necessarily put a label on his fatherhood style, he admits to sometimes spoiling his kids. But the spoiling comes with very high expectations, and if those expectations are not met, then they could very well get nothing. Find activities for your kids to engage in, not only for the benefits they will bring them later in life, but also for the added value of keeping them away from distractions. Fortnite. Expose your kids to what made you the person you are today. Culture, lifestyle, people, and places. Big up and bless up, Carlton. Thanks for your time. Yep, this is just the start of season 3. We got a lot more coming up. See you guys next week.